give his little ghost, but one he would be ashamed for her to hear. But his grandchild saw him now, and walked up to him with a childish stateliness, stumbling once or twice on what seemed her long shroud. Pushing up through the crowded shadows, she reached him, climbed upon his knee, laid her little long-haired head on his shoulders, and said, "Grandpa, you goomy? Isn't it your kissy day too, Grandpa?" A new fount of love seemed to burst from the clay of the old man's heart. He clasped the child to his bosom and wept. Then, without a word, he rose with her in his arms, carried her up to her room, and laying her down in her bed, covered her up, kissed her sweet little mouth, unconscious of reproof, and then went to the drawing-room. As soon as he entered, he saw the culprits in a quiet corner alone. He went up to them, took a hand of each, and joining them in both his, said, "God bless you." Then he turned to the rest of the company, and "Now," said he, "let's have a Christmas carol." And well he might, for though I have paid many visits to the house, I have never seen him cross since, and I am sure that must cost him a good deal of trouble. "We have just come from a great palace," said another, "where we knew there were many children, and where we thought to hear glad voices and see royally merry looks. But as soon as we entered, we became aware that one mighty shadow shrouded the whole, and that shadow deepened and deepened, till it gathered in darkness about the reposing form of a wise prince. When we saw him, we could move no more, but clung heavily to the walls, and by our stillness added to the sorrow of the hour. And when we saw the mother of her people weeping with bowed head for the loss of him in whom she had trusted, we were seized with such a longing to be shadows no more, but winged angels, which are the white shadows cast in heaven from the light of light, so as to gather around her and hover over her with comforting, that we vanished from the walls, and found ourselves floating high above the towers of the palace, where we met the angels on their way, and knew that our service was not needed." By this time there was a glimmer of approaching moonlight, and the king began to see several of those stranger shadows, with human faces and eyes, moving about amongst the crowd. He knew at once that they did not belong to his dominion. They looked at him, and came near him, and passed slowly, but they never made any obeisance or gave sign of homage. And what their eyes said to him, the king only could tell, and he did not tell. "What are those other shadows that move through the crowd?" said he to one of his subjects near him. The shadow started, looked round, shivered slightly, and laid his finger on his lips. Then, leading the king a little aside, and looking carefully about him once more, "I do not know," said he in a low tone, "what they are. I have heard of them often, but only once did I ever see any of them before. That was when some of us one night paid a visit to a man who sat much alone, and was said to think a great deal. We saw two of those sitting in the room with him, and he was as pale as they were. We could not cross the threshold, but shivered and shook, and felt ready to melt away. Is not your Majesty afraid of them too?" But the king made no answer, and before he could speak again, the moon had climbed above the mighty pillars of the Church of the Shadows, and looked in at the great window of the sky. The shapes had all vanished, and the king, again lifting up his eyes, saw but the walls of his own chamber, on which flickered the shadow of a little child. He looked down, and there, sitting on a stool by the fire, he saw one of his own little ones, waiting to say good night to his father and go to bed early, that he might rise early too, and be very good and happy all Christmas Day. And Ralph Rinkelmann rejoiced that he was a man and not a shadow. But as the shadows vanished, they left the sense of song in the king's brain, and the words of their song must have been something like these. Shadows, shadows, shadows all, shadow birth and funeral. Shadow moons gleam overhead, over shadow graves we tread. Shadow hope lives, grows and dies, shadow love from shadow eyes. Shadow word entices on to shadow words on shadow stone, closing up the shadow tale with a shadow wail. Shadow man, thou art a gloom, cast upon a shadow tomb, through the endless shadow air, from the shadow sitting there, on a moveless shadow throne, glooming through the ages gone, north and south, in and out, east and west, and all about, flinging shadows everywhere, on the shadow painted air. Shadow man, thou hast no story, nothing but a shadow glory. But Ralph Rinkelmann said to himself, "They are but shadows that sing thus, for a shadow can see but shadows. A man sees a man, where a shadow sees only a shadow." And he was comforted in himself. End of The Shadows by George MacDonald.